Hi and welcome to Midnight Cry. I'm your host, Rommel Gassain, and today we have with us Jay Smith, who'll be discussing with us the evolution of Islam. First of all, welcome to the show, Jay.
It's good to be here, Rommel.
Now, on the last segment, we were able to talk somewhat about the evolution of Islam. But my first question to you is, do we have any evidence or proof of that?
Yeah, if we want to look for evidence concerning how Islam emerged, you need to look at the historical material that is available. And there are now questions rising around places like the city of Mecca or the Qibla, the direction of prayer. Muslims will tell us, and they've said so they say 1400 years, that when Muhammad moved to Medina in the year 622, that he first made a relationship with the Jews there. And the reason why he moved was because the Jews that lived in Medina were having a problem with the Ansar, the native Arabs living in Medina. And they needed somebody that was neutral to arbitrate between the two groups, between the Jews and the Ansar. So he was asked to come up. According to Islamic tradition, this happened in 622. In order to ameliorate himself with the Jews, a revelation was sent down, supposedly, from Allah to Muhammad concerning the Qibla. The Qibla means the direction of prayer. Whenever a Muslim goes into a mosque, that mosque is directed towards Mecca. The mihrab, or the Qibla of that mosque, is always directed toward Mecca, no matter where you are in the world. As I was flying over here, I came on an airplane by Malaysian Airlines, and it's a Muslim Airlines. You could see that very quickly because the whole trip, all the way over here, on the screen was a map of where we were going, and they always showed where Mecca was at every minute. So if any Muslim wanted to pray during the trip, they always knew which direction to pray. And that, of course, that arrow towards Mecca kept on moving.
So that's
hour upon hour.
That's quite central. It's very important for a Muslim worshipper to know the direction of Mecca.
Absolutely, that's right. And that's called the Qibla, the direction of prayer. Now, in Surah 2, Ayah 145 to Ayah 149, that means in Book 2, verses 145 to 149, it mentions that when Muhammad moves to Medina, that the direction, the Qibla, the direction of prayer, the Qibla, was redirected up to Jerusalem to ameliorate the Jews, so he could have a relationship with the Jews.
So just to keep them happy, just to sort of come to some type of compromise.
Yeah, it doesn't really say that in the Quran, but that's the assumption that Muslims will give us. That was the case for 2 years, according to Islamic tradition. And then the Quran then says, now take the Qibla, and it then informs Muslims to bring it back down to Mecca in 624. So for 2 years, that Qibla was directed towards Jerusalem, according to Islamic tradition and according to the Quran, Surah 2, Ayah 145 to 149. Brought back down then to Mecca. And the reason why was because by 624, the Jews really had not accepted him. And that relationship with the Jews broke down. Once that relationship with the Jews broke down, then of course the confrontation with the Jews begins. And that starts in 624. We have the great battle of Badr, where Muhammad with 300 men goes and defeats the Quraysh from Mecca with 900 men. And he gives credit to God for giving him victory. Comes back to Medina, and he blames the Jews for not supporting him in that battle. And so he takes the first of the big 3 Jewish tribes that were living in Medina, the Banu Qaynuqa, and he exiles them, throws them out of Medina. Doesn't let them return to Medina, and takes all their provisions, all their wealth, and all their property for his men and for himself. Now, a year later, after the Battle of Uhud, which he lost, he came back and again blamed the Jews for not only supporting him, but also because he felt that they were allying with the Meccans. And he threw out the second Jewish tribe, the Banu Nadir. And that takes place in 625. 2 years later, in 627, the big battle of the trenches, which neither side lost. It was a stalemate battle. He blamed the third remaining Jewish tribe, the Banu Qurayza, the largest remaining Jewish tribe, the last one that was there. And we know from the traditions, especially from from Ibn Hisham, from the Sirah of the Prophet, that he then took all 800 men and slit their throats in one afternoon. Took the women as concubines for his men and wives, and then also the children as slaves. Now, that relationship with the Jews was obviously completely destroyed. from 624, 625, and 627, you can see that relationship destroyed. There was no longer any need to have a Qibla towards Jerusalem. It was now directed back down to Mecca. Here's the question. That's a historical fact that I've just given you. That's a historical statement. The Quran makes a historical statement. The Qibla was redirected towards Mecca. That means there needs to be some type of reference point that would support that. And the best thing to do is just take a look at the earliest mosques and let's see if they are directed
facing
there.
yes.
Now there have been two men, a man named Creswell, Dr. Creswell, and another man named Dr. Fehravardi. Both of them went around the Middle East back in 1905, over 100 years ago. They went back and they looked at all the earliest mosques they could find, researched the earliest mosques they could find, and they went down to the original floor plans of these earliest mosques. They went to Wasit and they went to Kufa. Both of these, you can see on the map here, are in present-day Iraq, near the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. So they're to the north of Mecca and northeast of Mecca. And when they dug down to the original floor plans of both these mosques in Wasit and in Kufa, they noticed that the Qibla on the original floor plans of both these mosques were facing west.
Wow.
But they should have been facing southwest. They should have been facing Mecca. Now these mosques were built long after 624. The dates for these mosques are as late as 660 and 680. They went to Fustat, which is just outside of Cairo in Egypt. It was the garrison town. And they found the oldest mosque there, the original mosque. They went to its floor plans, original floor plans, and they found it was facing east. It should have been facing southeast. So what's that tell you, Romel?
I mean, that's a big flaw. That's a big crack, because what we're saying there is that there was no change. The early worshippers, or what we know to be, whether they were Muslim or not, were still facing Jerusalem.
Yeah. Dan, there is another man, Dan Gibbons, who has done a book called Quranic Geography that just came out last year, in 2011. He has gone and spent about 2 or 3 chapters just looking at all the oldest mosques that we can find. And many of them still have their same floor plans from their original periods. Some of them have been destroyed, rebuilt, but the floor plans are still there. And he has pictured them and photographed them and showing that most of their Qiblas are in the wrong area. In fact, most of their Qiblas are going in the Iraqi and Jordan areas are facing west, and the ones in the west are facing east, but they should be facing southeast and southwest. And mosque after mosque after mosque, he's showing that the Qiblas are wrong. Now, that's the archaeological proof to show that something's going on in the 7th century that doesn't jive with the Islamic traditions, and it certainly doesn't jive with the Quran. When the Quran says very clearly in Surah 2 that the Qibla was canonized towards Mecca. If the archaeological evidence doesn't support Mecca, then you need to ask a question. Well, why were they all facing towards Jerusalem? Dan Gibson says it's probably Petra, it's not Jerusalem. But they're very close together. So yes. It could be Jerusalem, it could be Petra. We're not going to answer that question today. That's an ongoing question that we need to get more evidence for. Nonetheless, they're not facing Mecca. And what's more, what's in Jerusalem? Well, to answer that, you need to go back and look at Jerusalem. Now, have you ever been to Jerusalem?
No.
But some of those of you who are watching this have been to Jerusalem. I've been to Jerusalem. And when you go to Jerusalem, what's the building that stands out? Everybody sees it. I mean, it's the most splendid building in Jerusalem.
That's right. The Dome of the Rock?
The Dome of the Rock. Yeah. The Dome of the Rock. You can't miss it. Any picture of Jerusalem, it's a very drab-looking city. But there's the Dome of the Rock that sits right in the middle of the city with that beautiful golden dome.
Yes.
You can see a picture. We're going to put a picture up for you right now. Take a look at that Dome of the Rock. That was built in 691 by Abdul al-Malik. Here we get back to Abdul al-Malik again. Abdul al-Malik was the caliph between 685 to 705. He was the Marwanid caliph. He was the greatest of the Marwanid family. He built the Dome of the Rock in 691. Now, according to Islamic tradition, according to what Muslims tell us, they say that he built that building to commemorate the Mi'raj. The Mi'raj is the episode where Muhammad wakes up in the middle of the night and he's told to get on the back of a winged horse. And that winged horse is called the Burak, and he's supposed to then fly on that Burak from Medina up to Jerusalem. Gets to Jerusalem, gets off the horse, he's standing on the rock, and from the rock he then is sent to the 7 heavens up to the seventh heaven. And there, when he gets to the seventh heaven, he meets Allah. And Allah says to him, you must pray 50 times a day. He comes down 2 heavens, and there's Moses. And Moses says, what has Allah told you? He says, well, we must pray 50 times a day. He says, no. See if you can bring it down. So he goes up and sees if he can bring it down. And he comes back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, bringing the number of prayers from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30, all the way down to 5 prayers. Once they get to 5 prayers, Moses says, okay, go on back down. That's enough prayers. It's a very entertaining story. It's a great story to think about. But stop and ask yourself, if this story did ever happen, then, of course, coming back down to that rock that's there in Jerusalem, he then gets back on the winged horse and flies on back to Medina. Now, that building, according to tradition, was erected to commemorate that event. And every Muslim will tell you that that's the 3rd most holy shrine in Islam after Mecca and Medina. The mosque in Mecca, the Great Mosque, and of course the mosque in Medina, where Muhammad lived and died the last 12 years of his life. If that is so, the last 10 years of his life. If that is so, that building is built there to commemorate that event, right?
And that should have a very important clue there for us.
Yes, exactly.
Where does the Qibla there face?
So, good question. There should be a Qibla.
Yes.
There is no Qibla. There is no Qibla on the Dome of the Rock, anywhere in the Dome of the Rock.
Wow.
Go and take a look at the Dome of the Rock. And I would encourage you to go to Jerusalem. And I would encourage any of those who are watching, go to Jerusalem, go to the Dome of the Rock, and see if you can find a Qibla. There is no Qibla. Which suggests that it was built for another reason. Now, if you look in the Dome of the Rock on the inner ambulatory, the only original part of the building that was built in 691, the 2 inner ambulatories, there is inscriptions around the top. Look at those inscriptions, and there have been many people who have looked at these inscriptions and have interpreted them for us. They're written in Arabic. Some of them are Quranic, but they're not. They don't parallel the Quran that we have today. What's interesting is those inner ambulatory inscriptions, the earliest part of the Quran, of the building, they are written in 691. They don't mention anything about this mirage. They don't say anything about this event of him going on a back of a winged horse or going up to the 7 heavens. None of this story is in those or on those inscriptions.
Wow.
In fact, all those inscriptions are basically anti-Christian polemics. Reference after reference against Jesus Christ as God. Surah 4, Ayah 171 is there. Say not 3. Allah is one. For God has no son. There's a reference also to the Shahada. In fact, that's the first reference we have to the Shahada that includes Muhammad as part of it. Allah is one, and he has no partners. Now that's not part of the Shahada, but that's there on the Dome of the Rock. And Muhammad is his Rasulullah, the Prophet of God. Now, fascinating, there seems to be, when you look at that inner ambulatory, these are all polemics against Christianity. So the earliest inscriptions that we can find are attacks against the divinity of Jesus Christ.
Wow.
It was built as a polemic against the Byzantines, which makes sense because Jerusalem was controlled by the Byzantines before the Arabs controlled it. This is a rejection of Jesus Christ. That's one of the first things we see about Islam. On its very earliest inscriptions that we do find are all confrontation of Jesus Christ. Fascinating.
Wow.
And the idea that Jesus could be God. But that should be full of references to this event of why it was built.
Taking up, yeah.
It has no Qibla. I remember I did a debate back in 1998 with Abdul Green. Abdul Green is a well-known speaker in London. He is the spokesman for the Central Mosque there in Regent's Park. And we did a debate on the Dome of the Rock, but that wasn't the only reason. That was just one thing that came up, and he hammered me. He says, Jay, you don't know what you're talking about. You say there's no Qibla in the Dome of the Rock. Just take a look. Just take a look at the drum along the top. You'll see Surah 17, Ayah 1 is on the drum up there. And Surah 17, Ayah 1 talks about, and it says, for he, Muhammad, went from the great mosque to the farthest mosque. This is talking about the Miraj. It says right there on the drum. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for that event. It's right there along the drum. Go read it. If you don't believe me, go for yourself. And if you look on the southern portico, the southern door of the Dome of the Rock, there is Surah 2, Ayah 145 to 149. There's the Qibla. It's on the southern portico. I had to laugh when I heard that. And I said, Abdul Green, you haven't done your history, have you? You have no idea that the Dome of the Rock has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. It gets destroyed and rebuilt all the time.
So that inscription was placed there much later than the original building.
Yes, in fact, what's great about it is when you take a look and see, this is what Abdul Green didn't know, that the inscription on the dome, the drum at the top, and the one on the southern portico were only put there in 1876.
Quite recent,
It's
yes.
a little less than 150 years ago, proving that it's a much later inclusion. And the reason why it was put there was for this very reason. They needed to find a Qibla. They needed to have a Qibla, so they placed the inscriptions there to create the Qibla. Because how can you have the third most holy shrine in Islam that's not the mosque itself or the Kaaba itself from Medina or Mecca? How can you have it not having a Qibla? There's the difficulty. Now, if that is the case, then you need to ask, well, then why was the Dome of the Rock built? Look at the structure of the Dome of the Rock. It's built in an octagonal shape. Why would you build an octagonal shaped building? Why would you think? Unless it's for circumambulation.
Yes.
Perhaps this was one of the original sanctuaries, which would then help you understand why all the mosques are facing that direction. From east and west, and now why they were not facing Mecca. We won't know. That's just a question we're putting out there because there's no way to know since there's no sources. This is all something that's speculation. The problem is, what we do know is they were not facing as to Mecca yet. In fact, in 705. Now, what was even more interesting is that there are inscriptions written by Jacob of Edessa. Jacob of Edessa was traveling all around that part of the world, and he writes in 705 that the Maghrei, which is the name for the Arabs, were praying the same direction as we Christians and Jews pray. And he was saying this in Fustat in Cairo or in Egypt, what is present-day Egypt. Same direction facing towards Jerusalem. So here you have documentary evidence which supports the archaeological evidence that even as late as 705, the direction of prayer for the Maghrites, which would be another name for the Muslims, were facing the same way as the Christians and Jews.
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
That's a big problem.
Huge problem for Muslims because obviously this means that the Quran, either the Quran is in error or all these traditions are in error. But remember, the traditions that say that the Qibla was changed and that it was all being done in Mecca are written in the 9th century, like we talked about in the previous episode. Now, so what and where then was Mecca? How did it become important? What Muslims will tell us is that Mecca is absolutely important. It's the center of the world. Some Muslims will say the traditions refer to the fact that when Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, in Surah 7, you find that story, also in Surah 2 and also in Surah 20. But in Surah 7, verse 24, it mentions that Adam and Eve, because of their sin, they were then forgiven of their sin, and then they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden down to earth. And it just says in the Quran, down to earth. The traditions say that that's where they were thrown to was Mecca, which means it's the oldest city in the history of mankind, right? We also know that according to Islamic tradition and according to the trade route theory, that it was a center of trade, north, south, east, and west. And that it was a very big city, it was a very important city, and that's why when Muhammad was living there, he wanted to have control of it because it was where the Kaaba was. And the Kaaba is that square building that they all pray towards from all over the world. So Mecca is a hugely important city, is it not?
Oh, most certainly.
There are references to Mecca in the Quran, but very rarely does it talk about it, and that's why there's been a problem. Now, I want you to stop and ask yourself, today what do we know about Mecca? Well, today we know that Mecca is the center for all of Islam. More than that, it's the center for what we look at concerning the prayer and the traditions, the Hajj. You have to go to the Hajj, you have to go to Mecca, you have to do the sometimes 3, 4, up to 7 days. Muslims believe it's also where Abraham went. So in 1900 BC, Abraham went with Ishmael to rebuild the Kaaba. I didn't know Abraham ever went to Mecca, but that's what the Muslims tell me. By the time the 7th century AD rolls around, it is the center of the trade from Gaza in the north all the way down to Aden in the south. And from over as far over in Africa in the west all the way to Ctesiphon, which is the archaic name for Baghdad in the east and further beyond. I remember when I was studying Islam back in the 1980s, I remember reading Montgomery Watt, and Montgomery Watt talked about the great trade route theory. And what he said was this: the reason why Mecca was so great in the 7th century is because all the trade, and you look on the map there, I want you to look at the map here, all the trade goes from India, and it used to go up through the Persian Gulf. But remember what I said earlier, the Sassanids over in the eastern were warring against the Byzantines up here in the north. And they were warring back and forth, and as they warred back and forth, of course, that shut down the Persian Gulf. So what do you need to do? You need to redirect the trade. It can't go to the Persian Gulf anymore. It has to come down across the Arabian Sea over to Aden, which is today in, so what is the capital of Sana'a?
Yemen.
That's right, Yemen. So from Yemen in the south, you have Aden, then you have Sana'a, then you come on up to Taif, and then you come up to Yathrib, Khaybar, Tabuk, and then on up to Gaza in the north. Those are the great trading route. And according to Montgomery Watt, that all the trade went that direction, went up right up the Western Plateau. That's what he tells us. And so most people have bought into the trade route theory. The Muslims as well, because it helps them out. Because that then says that Mecca must have been great. Of course, what Montgomery Watt assumed is that the trade went from Aden up to Sana'a, Najran, Taif, and then down to Mecca, and then up to Yathrib, which later became Medina, then Khaybar, Tabuk, and on up. That's what he says. Dr. Patricia Crona questioned that. She said, hold on a minute, stop and ask. Look at this map again. I want to show you the map. Everybody look, in fact, you people look at the map, and you will see, take a look at where these places are. Sana'a, Taif, and then look where Mecca is. It's down off the plateau. It's about 1,000 feet off the plateau. Which means that any caravans that are coming from the south down in Aden, going on up to Taif, they'd have to go down 1,000 feet to get down to Mecca, then come back up 1,000 feet to get up to Yathrib again.
It'd make no sense.
It would make no sense. She said, why hadn't anybody thought this through? She wrote a book in 1987 called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. And she questioned this. Just hold on a minute. Anybody who's looking in the 7th century would have to start questioning this, because not only is Mecca off the trade route, it's down off the plateau. It has no water. It could not have accommodated any caravans. So how could the caravans how could they have gone there, replenish their supplies, and head on up? And how could Mecca, which is such a small hamlet, control all of this area of the Hadramaut and the Hijaz? The Hadramaut is the southern area. So she wrote a book, and she wanted to find out if this was true. Now, this woman reads and writes 15 languages, so she went all back to the original languages, and she said, let's look at the spices that the Muslims say were being grown in that area, which would have made Mecca great. She looked at all 15 spices. In fact, in her book, she takes a chapter per spice, and she shows that all the spices, all of them except for 2, didn't even come from the Arabia. There were no spices grown in Arabia except for myrrh and incense, frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense and myrrh were the only incense that you can find in Arabia, and they were grown in the southern part, down the Hadramaut area, what is Oman and Yemen today. All the other spices come from India in the west, in the east, and Ethiopia and Africa in the west. Now, we're going to have to unpack this. So what we're going to do is we're going to say a little bit more about this, and we're really going to look into Mecca in the next episode, because there's so much about Mecca that's going to destroy the whole authenticity of the emergence of Islam. Because Mecca is central to everything Muslims need. Mecca is where the sanctuary is. Mecca is where Abraham lived. Mecca is where Ishmael went with Abraham to rebuild the Kaaba. Mecca is where the center of the earth is. According to Muslims, that's where Adam and Eve were sent down to. Dr. Patricia Crone, as we're going to find in the next episode, destroyed all the notion of Mecca.
Wow.
We're going to get into it. It's important that we do. Stay with us. Stay with me, Rommel, because it gets pretty exciting now what we're going to find out about Mecca.
Jay, thank you for your time once again.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
To our viewers, we really hope that you've been able to look in and find out for yourself some of these things that you've assumed to be true, whether they actually were true. We want you to stay in tune for the very next episode as we continue to discuss the importance of Mecca and whether or not Mecca really existed as we've been told by many of the Muslim scholars. Please stay in tune for the very next episode of Midnight Prayer.